Thank you all. Welcome back. So let's continue with our next presentation. So welcome the presentation of Cheryl Cook, Director of the East Asia Assessment Solutions Team at the British Council, and Elaine Schmidt, Senior Research Manager at the Cambridge Assessment English.
Welcome and thank you very much for attending this presentation. My name is Cheryl Cook. I am the Director of the East Asia Assessment Solutions Team for the British Council, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Jyväskylä. I am presenting on behalf of two researchers, myself and Elaine Schmidt from Cambridge Assessment English. The title of our presentation is Comprehensibility Features in Rating Scale Design, a Preliminary Study. Before going into details about the study itself and our findings, I'd like to provide a little bit of context. This research study was part of a larger IELTS prototype project, an initial, very early stage proof of concept project that took an exploratory approach to all components of the test. This analysis focused on a very small part of the speaking test prototype only. The prototype project in relation to the speaking test had two components, the first being speaking task revision and the second being scale revision. In order to contextualize our study a little further, I'll describe very briefly the tasks that we focused on. There were two tasks. One was the Oral Proficiency Interview, which is familiar to many people, and an additional task component was added, and that was an integrated task where it was listening audio into speaking, which was recorded online on a computer. The integrated tasks were made up of 4 tasks altogether, and tasks 1 to 3 each had 90 seconds of audio input, 15 seconds of preparation time, and 30 seconds of response time. The recorded response time had an automated cutoff. As expected, the first tasks focused on less abstract, more concrete functions and skills, such as summarizing, paraphrasing, and highlighting of salient information. Task 3 attempted to or intended to elicit description information and giving opinions. And task 4, which was shorter in terms of input time at only 60 seconds, longer in terms of preparation time, 60 seconds, because test takers were required to come up with their own ideas and their own opinions in relation to the topic, and longer as well in terms of response time, was designed to elicit giving advice and elaborating. As mentioned, the second component of the prototype project in relation to the speaking test looked at scale revision, and while various scales were retained from the original test and 2 scales, mediation and comprehensibility, were introduced, our study focused specifically on the comprehensibility scale, and from here on in this presentation I will be focusing on that. Our research question for this study was, are the indicators targeted by the comprehensibility scales observed in performances? And as a sub-question to this, we were also interested in whether any fluency or pronunciation features correlated with higher or lower bands. Several reasons for the introduction of a comprehensibility scale in the prototype project. First of all, as is well documented and reported these days, most conversations in English do not include a native speaker. Most are between non-native speakers of English. And this is also the case for the target language use situation for which IELTS is most often used, that of academia and tertiary education. There's also a recognition that there are many English varieties, both native speaker and non-native speakers, as well as the use of English as a lingua franca. As such, it should be comprehensibility that's the focus, and it should be comprehensibility that is being tested rather than any particular approximation of a native speaker benchmark. This follows Lewis's intelligibility principle. We also wanted the scales to include features that are typically associated with comprehensibility based on research, based on studies and literature. And these are most often pronunciation and fluency features. Another key consideration was that the scale needed to be operationalizable by raters. The development of the comprehensibility scales for the prototype project took the following approach. First, we considered the existing IELTS scales as well as literature and research. This was taken to an expert panel who discussed and had input into the first iteration of the comprehensibility scales. These scales were taken to trial for the prototype, which included rating by expert raters and rater focus groups to understand how they might have operationalized not only the comprehensibility scale, but the revised scales more generally. Following this, we did an analysis of the linguistic data that related specifically to the comprehensibility scales. And this is one of the key aspects of this particular study. There was also consideration of focus group comments, although I won't be talking about that in this presentation. We also did a correlation of linguistic analysis and the scores that were awarded by the raters. The output of this was recommendations for iteration 2. Scale iteration 1 combined fluency and phonological features of the existing IELTS scales. The fluency scale is made up of cohesion and coherence features, and these were subsumed as a component of the mediation scale, along with other features in that scale. What is of interest to us in this study is the fluency features of the fluency scale, temporal features, for example. And these, together with segmental features from the pronunciation scale, as well as suprasegmental features from the existing pronunciation scale, were combined under the comprehensibility scale. We also reordered the descriptors to go from a holistic descriptor that focused on effort of the listener to more discrete feature-based descriptors, reflecting the underlying construct of comprehensibility, which is about ease of understanding. This slide presents bands 6 to 9 of the comprehensibility scale in the prototype proof of concept study. There are 2 examples I've highlighted here of features that this study focused on and which I will be reporting on later. For example, hesitation, repetition, and self-correction, and successful control of individual sounds. You can also see how the scale moves from holistic, effortless to understand, through fluency and through the segmental and suprasegmental features associated with pronunciation. Effort, of course, being linked to the underlying construct of comprehensibility, which is usually defined as ease of understanding. This shows bands 0 to 5 of the same prototype proof of concept comprehensibility scale, and you'll see the same things reflected here. Just to pick out 2 examples of individual features that this study will be reporting on a bit later. For example, stress, in our case word stress, and also again, as seen in the previous slide, control over individual sounds. Moving on to our data sample, we had 23 usable samples, or 23 test takers, and each test taker had 4 responses, 3 of 30 seconds each and 1 of 60 seconds, so a total of no more than 2.5 minutes for each speaker and for each test taker. Unfortunately, the data collection method meant that we had very little control over the audio quality, and as you will see, this affected the conclusions that we could make from the study and contributed to the limitations. There was a range of L1 backgrounds, although this was not the focus of the study. There was also a range of proficiency levels, and although we hoped to have a fully balanced study, the sample size and the other considerations meant that it was not fully balanced, particularly in terms of the higher level speakers and the lower level speakers, where there were fewer samples. Experienced raters rated these samples, and these were selected based on the agreement between 2 raters. Moving on to our method of analysis. The audio samples for each of our 23 test takers were analysed using Pratt software. The analysis of the features was very much shaped by various different factors. First of all, the fluency and phonological features reported in the literature, and specifically in the Isaacs and Trofimovich 2012 study, as well as more general research on comprehensibility and on the IELTS scales. Indicators included in the iteration 1 of the comprehensibility scale, which we have just highlighted, were also the key focus of our analysis where possible. The analysis was also shaped and limited by coding resources deadlines and typical limitations of a prototype project. And unfortunately, audio quality meant that certain features we would have liked to analyse could not be analysed. The 2 researchers independently coded different levels of analysis in Pratt. We coded at the utterance, word and syllable level, and syllables were further coded in terms of whether they were fillers, hesitation, repetition, pause or self-correction, and also coded for mispronunciation at the syllable level, including segmental, syllable structure and word stress. And although these were coded separately, we do not report the findings separately, as will be shown later. 12 experienced raters rated the various samples, and the selection of samples was based on exact rater agreement between 2 raters. Score levels were correlated with features in the statistical analysis. As mentioned in the previous slide, the features that we analysed were determined by a number of different factors. On the left-hand side of this table, you'll see the features that we intended to analyse, and on the right-hand side, the realisation in our study, with other words, the features that we were able to analyse after limitations and constraints on our study. The first one refers to mean length of run, MLR, and is defined as the average number of syllables between pauses, filled or unfilled, in the Isaacs and Trofimovich 2012 study. Our realisation was as mean duration, time, rather than syllables. We also analysed speech rate, typically defined as the number of syllables per second, and we discounted pauses and repetitions from the syllable count in our analysis. We looked at fillers and hesitations. The frequency and duration of filled and unfilled pauses is how it's defined in the Isaacs and Trofimovich study, and these were analysed. We also looked at repetitions and self-corrections. The frequency of repetitions and self-corrections are obviously linked to fluency, and this is how it is typically defined. We analysed these indicators but it was realized in the overall analysis of errors as a combined indicator, simply because of time constraints and also because it was quite difficult to tell sometimes whether something was an error, whether it was a self-correction or a repetition. These are other features that we looked at. Segmental error ratio refers to the phonemic substitution, with other words, mispronunciation of a particular phoneme, divided by the number of phonemes overall. Unfortunately, we did not have the resources to code and label in part at the phoneme level. We just labeled at the syllable level. And so calculation of this error ratio was based on mispronunciation of the number of syllables, even where only one phoneme within that syllable was mispronounced. Syllable structure error ratio refers to where vowels or consonants are added or dropped from a word, changing the structure of syllables in the words. An example is pronouncing special as e-special. Word stress error ratio obviously looks at the incorrect placement of word stress. These were labelled based on syllables that were incorrectly stressed, and we combined this into an analysis of all these indicators in the overall analysis of errors. Ratio was calculated as total errors over total number of syllables, as I've alluded to already. We had hoped to look at vowel reduction ratio, but because this is extremely time consuming and intensive, because it requires a human rater, an experienced rater and expert to identify where the vowels are not reduced, we were unable to do this, unfortunately. We had hoped to look at pitch contour and pitch range, and we could not do this due to the poor quality of many of the audio samples. We did look at cutoffs and response lag time, which were not part of the previous studies that we looked at. Cutoffs refers to where speakers were automatically cut off by the timed recording system. So they were mid-sentence, for example, and seemed to be still delivering their turn when the recording stopped, given that there was a particular time window. This was analysed. We looked at response lag time. While speakers were given a number of seconds as preparation time before they started speaking and before the recording started, there was sometimes a delay between the start of the recording and the onset of the speaker's response. And this seemed to correlate with proficiency level, and so we analysed that. Moving on to the findings of our study. There was no clear correlation between mean length of run and different levels of proficiency, and there were clearly individual differences highlighted here by our one test taker at the band 4 level, who clearly was an anomaly. Speech rate is reported as the number of syllables over the length of the utterance times 100, as can be seen on the y-axis of the graph here. We did not include, as was mentioned before, filled and unfilled pauses or silences. With other words, the length of the utterance did not include those aspects. We subtracted the filled and unfilled pauses or silences from the length of the utterance. One of the reasons for this was because of the planning time that some of the test takers seemed to take. We noticed a positive correlation between speech rate and higher bands, although the speaker at band 4 was an anomaly. As mentioned, we looked at fillers and hesitations, and while we did not find a correlation between frequency and proficiency level, we did find a correlation between duration of the fillers and hesitations, which was much longer at the lower end of the scale. And here the blue refers to the hesitations and the red refers to the fillers. When we looked at the number of errors over the total number of syllables, the error ratio, there did seem to be a pattern in terms of correlations with proficiency levels, with the Band 7 test takers showing individual differences, being a bit of an anomaly, but overall there's a clear high correlation between a number of errors at the lower bands and negative correlation with number of errors and the higher bands. Remember, we were combining segmental, syllable, structure, word stress errors, as well as the repetitions and self-corrections labelled at the syllable level. In answer to our original research question, which was presented at the beginning, are the indicators targeted by the comprehensibility scales observed in test taker performances? The answer is yes, some of them. And there is also some indication that certain features correlate with more proficient speakers, or, for example, error rates are higher at lower levels. However, there are a number of different limitations to the study, and clearly more research is needed before we can arrive at any conclusive results. Moving on to the conclusions, limitations, and recommendations of our study. The prototype proof of concept stage meant that sample size, audio quality, time and resourcing were key limitations, and a lot more research is needed going forward. Our analysis supported inclusion of some temporal indicators such as length of turns and speech rate, but perhaps the frequency of hesitation and fillers is not necessary. Control of individual sounds seems to be something that should be included in the study, given the errors, the error frequency in relation to the proficiency level, but it could also be operationalized as overall effort to understand or even impact on the message. Our recommendations for iteration 2 of the prototype proof of concept included some rewording in response to the examiner feedback from the focus groups, but not in response to the analysis. Although we found some indication that frequency of hesitation and fillers, for example, should not necessarily be included, there is insufficient evidence, and the sample size is not large enough to make that conclusive. On behalf of my co-researcher and myself, I would like to say thank you for listening. I hope to be available for questions if my connectivity allows, and welcome any questions that you might wish to send by email too. Looking at the summary of findings, we saw that measures of fluency showed progression across the levels. So, for example, speech rate. There was faster speech rate that was correlated with the higher levels, and the cumulative speech duration was longer at higher levels, although there were some individual differences, as pointed out in a previous slide. There was no difference in the number of hesitations and fillers across levels, which is why I did not report the frequency in depth. It didn't seem to be meaningful. However, the duration of hesitations is shorter at the higher levels. Segmental errors are less frequent at higher levels, and errors in general, as you could see from the previous slide. When we looked at the cutoffs and response lag time, we found there was no completely linear progression in cutoffs. There were fewer cutoffs at band 7.5 than band 6, for example, although that could indicate that less planning time was needed at higher levels. Something worthy of looking at a little bit more in depth, of course. The response time, or the response lag time, as we have been calling it, is longer at lower levels. Again, possibly reflecting that extra planning time that is needed before the respondent starts to speak.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that interesting presentation. Elaine, of course, thank you for such a relevant study.